Peggy and Patty McDaniel were 17-year-old sisters from New Jersey staying with their father in Live Oak, Florida. Unbeknownst to their parents, in mid-August of 1979, they took a trip to the Fort Lauderdale area. A month later, on September 15th, the sisters were supposed to go to a club in Pompano Beach with a man they had met. A few days later, this man was found shot dead. The girls were never seen again. I'm Ed Denzel, and this is Unfound. If you watch enough detective shows or movies, whether it be a police procedural like Law & Order, or something more unique like Columbo, or if you read enough mystery novels, you can begin to believe that solving a murder or disappearance is as simple as finding that coincidence or unique fact that nobody else can see. For example, in the movie The Silence of the Lambs, Clarice has the help of Dr. Lecter to point her in the right direction where she figures out the killer knew his first victim, a fact no one else noticed. In the film Seven, the detectives discover the murderer, who kills according to the 7 deadly sins, has checked out certain books concerning that topic at a library, leading them to where he lives. And if you want to go way back, in Edgar Allan Poe's novel Murders in the Rue Morgue, which could be considered the first modern detective story, Dupin surmises the crimes weren't committed by a human at all, despite everyone else claiming otherwise. In a way, at least in fiction, all the police have to do is connect the dots. All the proof is there, right in front of their faces. All they have to do is see it. But as we know, real life isn't so simple. However, in this case, the disappearances of Peggy and Patty McDaniel, if it hadn't been for a completely innocuous statement made by the murdered man to his mother the day of his death, this disappearance would have no suspects, no persons of interest, and in fact, the disappearances of Peggy and Patty wouldn't be connected to this man's death at all. Yet, this case is also an example of how police can get off track if they take into account too much information without analyzing it further. And now the facts of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Good's site, charlieproject.org, although it should be noted, this case is not on there. I hope I can work with Megan to get it listed there very soon. Peggy and Patty McDaniel were 17-year-olds living with their mother in New Jersey. Their parents were divorced, with the father living in Live Oak, Florida. The two were fraternal twins and very close, to the point that their mother, Joyce, believed allowing one of them to live with their father would help their individual growth and help them make more friends. However, after a $300 phone bill run up by the girls talking to each other, and also due to their mother having surgery, both daughters ended up going to live with their father in Florida in February 1979. Joyce was wary of this due to an accident on a prior trip in which Patty was hit in the eye with a ricocheted bullet shot by a friend of hers. The girls stayed with their father and his new wife through the summer. Peggy and Patty did not care for their stepmother and mentioned this many times. During this time, they'd befriended Marvin Warren in Live Oak, a boy 2 years older who had known the girl's older sister when she lived with their father a few years before. At some point, and the exact date is not known, but it is presumed to be mid-August 1979, the girls left with Marvin and another man, Ed Gross, and took a trip to Pompano Beach, a city 365 miles south of Live Oak. The girls did this without letting anyone, including their parents and friends, know that they were leaving. In Pompano Beach, Ed Gross got an apartment and they all lived there. The girls got jobs working at a shoe store and a fast food restaurant. Yet, a few weeks into their time there, Peggy and Patty sent a letter to their mother saying they wanted to come back to New Jersey. The girls gave no explanation as to why they were far from home, how they got there, and what they were doing. There was also no mention of Ed Gross or Marvin Warren or how their mother could reach her daughters by phone. Their mother stunned that her daughters weren't in Live Oak, wrote right back and told them to go immediately to the airport and to call or collect from a payphone. However, there is no proof the girls ever received this letter. Later, in a seemingly unrelated incident, Nelson Johnson, a resident of Pompano Beach, was found in the trunk of his car, shot to death, and over $1,000 was discovered to be missing from a briefcase he carried. Police, during their investigation of the murder, discovered that Nelson had told his mother that he was going to meet, quote-unquote, the white girls the night of September 15th, 1979. The police believe Nelson meant Peggy and Patty because as kids, Nelson had known Ed Gross, and the girls were with Gross before Nelson was murdered. Since the night of Nelson's murder, Peggy and Patty McDaniel have never been seen again despite various rumors, and Nelson's murder is still unsolved. The interview for this episode is with Peggy and Patty's mother, Joyce Rivituzo. Unfound News. I conducted an interview with Detective Kenneth Maines from the American Investigative Society of Cold Cases. I frankly didn't even know an organization like his existed. I'm certainly happy to know that now. My talk with him will play on an upcoming episode. In the meantime, please check out the group's website, aisocc.org. I'm hoping some of the families we've had on Unfound can petition their respective police departments to send their loved ones' case files to Ken's group. I'm also very close to picking a new logo for Unfound. Yes, we're still working on it. I've been coordinating with a couple different listeners who have graciously put in hours coming up with original ideas. I can't thank them enough. I think what I'm going to do is pick one for the standard no-nonsense logo, then pick another one that is a little more stylized for special occasions. That's my idea right at this second anyway. And finally, and I'll be mentioning this until the first get-together happens, May 9th, 6 p.m. at the Madeira Beach Library, the first meetup for amateur sleuths wanting to solve disappearances in Pinellas County, Florida. If you live close to here, I would love for you to attend. Where you can find Unfound: on Twitter, @UnfoundPodcast. On Instagram, also @UnfoundPodcast. You can email the program, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. On Facebook, the Unfound Podcast discussion group. Numbers have shot up recently. Now we're easily over 200 people. That's pretty good for a private group. I want to do a regular Facebook page, but at this point, I'm not sure I have the time to manage the discussion where the forum is a little more open. You can subscribe to Unfound at Podomatic and iTunes, and if you could, please give Unfound a great review. And finally, please mention Unfound at all the regular places like Web Sleuths, Reddit, podcasts we listen to, and any other true crime forums. A couple notes before the interview. This is a fairly unknown case. I didn't even know about it until about a month ago when Mary Lyle, yes, mother of Suzanne Lyle, called me and told me that I needed to talk to Joyce, and I'm so glad that Mary did that. It's been a joy getting to know Joyce. I really like her. But it's a fairly unknown case, and it's fairly convoluted. So I ask you to pay special attention maybe to this interview. In addition, if any of you did any pre-studying knowing that we were going to be covering this case, you might have gone to some place like Reddit where there is a thread regarding this case. I can tell you the most of the information in that thread is incorrect. And in fact, we're going to talk about that during the interview. So even things you think you might know about this case, having done some studying of it before listening to this program, probably a lot of what you read is wrong. Joyce and I tried to correct the record during our interview. I'm so happy to have on this episode of Unfound the mother of Peggy and Patty McDaniel, Joyce Rivituzo. Joyce, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you so much, Shed.
Joyce, tell the listeners a little bit about your daughters. They were twins, weren't they?
Yes, they were fraternal twins, but they looked amazingly alike. And they caused a big uproar when they were younger because they did look alike and people couldn't tell them apart. Of course, you know the mom can always tell them apart. And they grew up very sheltered. They were not children that were world-wise. They did have a little problem. They had a difficult birth, and because of that, I think we probably sheltered them more because we felt that they needed a little extra attention. But they were not developmentally handicapped. They were slow learners when they were young, but they had many attributes that they followed that made them wonderful children.
What did they like to do, the both of them? You've told me that they were almost inseparable, but what did they like to do together?
They were inseparable. I mean, they were like two peas in a pod. And they had started playing the piano because their oldest sister was taking piano lessons. And then they started picking out the tunes on their own. I think they were like a little musically inclined because they just picked it up. And they were in all kinds of groups where they were baton twirlers. They were in gymnastics. They loved gymnastics and dance. And I would say when they were small, they loved to go to church, but when they got older, they drugged their feet.
Uh-huh.
They were just beautiful, happy girls. I mean,
and so they got along. They were not, you have other children, but those two, they never fought. I mean, sometimes, sisters can be, a little petty and catty and things as they go into their teenage years. You're telling us your daughters were not like that.
Not them two.
No.
Not
Okay.
those two. Those two, oh my gosh, if I could go back and just think about, we used to take a lot of car trips. And I took them on vacation every year, never left them anywhere. And they were into togetherness. I mean, they had to clap their hands together and sing. And it was, they were not children that fought. You know how brothers and sisters will fight?
Yeah.
No. Those two didn't. They were just, it was like they were in a cocoon together. They were just inseparable.
Yeah. I have twins run in my biological family. Were you surprised when you found out that you were going to have twins? Does that run in your family or their father's family?
Yes, they do. They run on their biological father's side. They run in his family like every other generation. So it was our generation, I guess, to have them.
Speaking of their father, what kind of relationship, and we're going to get much deeper into this as the interview goes on, but what kind of relationship did they have with their father? And you two ended up, of course, getting divorced. But what relationship did they have?
Well, Ed, I hate to say this really because it disappoints me so bad and it's causing me a lot of tears in my lifetime. My husband was a truck driver, and a lot of the time he was not home. In all of our marriage, my children and I basically lived alone except for whenever his truck rolled in. And it got to where he very seldom rolled in. He stayed on the road because he was with other women. And I know I forgave him many times because I grew up in a family of English and Scots that you don't divorce. You know what I'm saying? Back then,
Yeah.
the woman waited on the man, and did all the housework, all the caring for the children, and that's the way he was. He never, ever had anything to do with the raising of our children, except for the fact that when we did divorce, I didn't want him not to see his children, so I made it a point to make sure that him and his parents saw the children. And when the children and I moved to New Jersey in the late 70s, or in 1975, I left them with the three oldest children. I took the two youngest ones, and I left the twins and their older sister with the father until I could get a place to live and come back and get them.
You were living in Florida, but you moved to New Jersey. He stayed in Florida, and then the girls though ended up living with you. Though they eventually did come and live with you,
yeah,
Peggy and Patty.
Oh yes.
Okay.
I didn't waste any time coming back to get my children. The only thing is, when I came back to get them a few weeks later, it's when I found out that the Patty, one of the twins, had an accident where a stray bullet off of a street hit her in the eye and blinded her, right in the left eye. So that right there, which I knew nothing about, that tells you right there what kind of a father they had.
So that happened, and he didn't call you to say, you know what, our daughter just had an accident.
Nothing.
Yeah, you just, when you went to get them is when you found out that.
Yes.
That is something. What were the circumstances, if you can tell the listeners very quickly, what were the circumstances of her getting hit in the eye in the first place?
On a Friday night is when their father decided that they could go to the movies by themselves, and it was just a small town, but I don't care what town it is. There's always trouble in any town.
This is Live Oak. This is Live Oak, Florida.
And that's the night she got her eye hit. Was the night I left, or the day I left to go to New Jersey. He let them go off that same night, and that's when her eye got hurt. Some kid from the town had a gun. I understand it was a rifle, and it discharged, hit the street or a building, the police said, and it ricocheted and just happened to hit her right in the left eye. And I knew nothing about it. I mean, he would not let my children use his telephone. They were never allowed to call me from his house. When they called me, it was when they could sneak off to one of their school buddies, I guess, down there or whatever, and call me collect.
Did your daughters know this?
I didn't know anything about it.
Did your daughters know this kid who had the gun, or is this just a freak accident?
The person?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was like they knew him from school down there. He was just a kid. Now, they were 14 at the time.
Okay, so this was a few years before they disappeared.
This kid was like 15, 16 years old. And, I never heard what happened with that case. I don't know if they just deemed it an accident or whether they charged the young man with discharge of a firearm. I never heard.
Did your daughter have to wear a patch? I mean, what was the status of her eye after it got hit?
Oh, they kept her eye, but she had absolutely no sight. But the eyeball itself was still there.
Now let's move up to 1979, and what happened then? You had told me that we had talked about earlier, the two girls were inseparable, but you started
Yes.
to be a little, I don't know, concerned about that or something like that, and one of them moved to Florida while one of them stayed with you. Is that how that worked out?
I felt that they were just inseparable. They were not branching out like to be two different people. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And they started causing a little trouble because they were, I mean, even when they had a babysitting job, they had to do it together. I decided, because Peggy said, well, I'll live with Dad. And I said, are you sure? Because I knew that the stepmother did not like me or my children. And she said, yeah, I'll be all right. And she said, I'll just, I've got friends that I had here before, and I'll be fine. So I left them with their dad. Regrettably now I did then. I just wish I had never left that child. But what started it off, they had been living with me in New Jersey for several years. And then I let her stay, and the father let her start dating, which I had never let the girls even think about dating. I mean, when they were with me, there was never any mention of wanting to date because they knew I was not going to let them date until they were 16 years old or mature enough to date, that I felt they were mature enough. And I think that's what started the problem, because then Peggy would call Patty, okay? Patty was with me and Peggy was in Florida. And they ran up a $300 a month phone bills calling back and forth. That's when I decided this isn't going to work. I'm going to have to get Peggy and bring her back home. And
But instead, both of them ended up in Florida with their father.
Yeah, because I became ill. I had a problem and needed major surgery. So I still had 4 of my kids in New Jersey, and I don't know exactly to this day why the father came on February the 9th of 1979 to pick up Patty at that particular time. But I was out of work for a while, and I said, well, maybe it'd be better, if you girls were together, because I can't afford your phone bills. And that's where the phone bill thing came in, is it was between them two. And every dollar that Patty could get, she sent it to Peggy. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It was just like there was never a real separation mentally with those children.
And you and their father didn't have much communication, did you? You two didn't talk.
We had none.
None.
Absolutely none.
Peggy and Patty are both down there as of February of 1979. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Do they go to school?
I don't know. They told me they were in school because when they left, she took all of her, her notebook, her school clothes, things like that. And I tell you, I assume that the man kept them in school. I assume that. At the time, I was in a bad shape, but I just assumed that he put them, in school. I mean, Patty was in school when she left, so I just assumed he put her in the school. And like I said, they never called me from their father's house. Never.
And So once they're both in Florida from February of 1979 until, let's say, May or June of 1979, did either of them, when they called you, did they ever talk to you about enrolling at a school in Live Oak, Florida,
No,
or anything? Never said anything to you.
no.
So your daughters are down there in Florida. They're not having a lot of contact with you. Your husband has no contact with you. He doesn't want to talk to you. You don't want to talk to him. And before we get into the circumstances of their disappearance, can you tell the listeners a little bit about Ed Gross and Marvin Warren, just the generalities of how your daughters might have known these two?
Okay, the way they might have known Marvin Warren is because he had went to high school with my oldest daughter, who was 16 when I left Live Oak. Okay.
This would have been an older
And
sister. This would have been an older sister of Peggy and Patty.
yes,
Okay.
an older sister. Yes,
Okay.
and I understood from her that she had seen him at school, but she didn't really know him. Now, that's what she told me. And Marvin Warren lived right there in the middle of that town with his parents. Now, Edward Gross, I am not sure exactly what that man's real name is, because the newspapers, Sergeant Madge from the Lauderdale Police Department called him Edwin.
Mm-hmm.
He was called Edward. And I think they may have called him Eddie in that town, because I did find something on an Eddie Gross that had died. So
Ed Gross and Ed Gross and Marvin Warren were friends. Although
friends.
Ed Gross was, Ed Gross was quite a bit older than Marvin, wasn't he? Though.
Yes, Ed Gross was like 36 at the time, according to the newspapers.
Okay, okay. And Marvin Warren was more like 19, around your other daughter's age.
19. Yeah.
Okay. So those names are going to come up here in a little bit for the listeners. What did you think, like the summer of 1979, what was your understanding as to what your daughters were doing? Did they have summer jobs? Were they hanging out with friends? Do you remember any of that?
They told me, Patty and Peggy, when I was talking to them, they said, we got a job at the newspaper place over here. We're like folding newspapers and all, and it's just a little job to keep us busy during the summer. So I said, well, that's good that you've got out. Now, when I think back on it, Ed, I'm wondering if somehow they didn't meet these guys maybe when they were at this newspaper place. They had to have met them someplace, because they hadn't been in Florida that long, like in May. I think they met these guys like in May or June. And that would have worked out with their job at the newspaper place. So I didn't think anything about it. I thought, well, that's good. They got them a little summer job, and they're okay. They never mentioned anything about anything.
Okay. So you had to be fairly surprised when you got a letter from them in August stating that they were in the Pompano Beach area.
Yes.
And people don't have to go to a map, the listeners. Live Oak, Florida is in the north part of Florida. It's close to like Georgia or, Alabama. Whereas Pompano Beach is down in South Florida near Miami. And so your daughters wrote you a letter in New Jersey from down in the Miami area. You had to be very surprised by that.
I was totally shocked. I mean, I was totally shocked. And and I remember this so well. It was, I don't remember the date exactly. It was like the 28th or 29th. I mailed them a letter on August the 30th going back down to Pompano Beach, explaining to them that I would help bring them home because they wanted to come home.
Yeah, what did that letter say? What did that letter say? How long was it? And
it was a couple of pages, yeah.
Okay.
It was a couple of pages long, and it was written, it was Patty's handwriting, because I know Patty's handwriting. They didn't have the same handwriting. I mean, I knew the difference. And Patty said, "Mom, we're down here in South, and we are in trouble. We don't know what to do. We're in a situation we cannot get out of. Please help us to come home." And I took that as an urgent plea.
Of course.
So they didn't leave me a phone number to call or anything. So the thing that I did is I just sat right down, mailed them a letter right back, telling them to go to the airport, and when they get there to call me, because I had moved and I had a different phone number. That's why they didn't call me. I moved from one house to another area of Jersey, and my phone number was different. And that's why they wrote me instead of calling me, okay? So I sent them a letter right back, giving them my phone number, and that we were now living in Linden, New Jersey, and to go to the airport immediately, give me a call. I will have you tickets to come home.
In that letter, were the names Ed Gross or Marvin Warren ever mentioned? No mention of that. They never. The daughters never specifically mentioned the trouble or the problems or anything that they were in.
No.
Did they mention their father?
No.
Nothing. Okay.
They did. No, it was all about Mom. We love you. We're sorry we're in this mess. It was a letter pleading to come home is actually what it was.
And no explanation of what they were doing down in that area? None. Okay.
None. They didn't want to hurt me. Don't you understand? They knew that I would have been devastated, but they also knew that I would have never been against them. But their father, oh my gosh, they had lived with him, telling them that I didn't want them and all of that, and that was bad, okay? But they mentioned nothing about a man. They just said, we need to come home, Mom. We want to come home.
Okay.
Then, let me tell you what happened, though. I sent that letter. I waited, to give them ample time to get the letter. Well, the 5th day of September there, a hurricane came in right at Fort Lauderdale in that area, Pompano Beach, Fort Lauderdale area. And I'm sitting at home. Well, I was working at the time, but I'm saying, well, there's a hurricane down there, and those girls just hadn't got back to me. So what I did, I wrote them another letter. And I said the same thing. Where are you girls at? Are you okay after that hurricane? And get a ride. If you have to call the sheriff's department, get a ride to go to the airport. Well, I never heard anything. I never got either letter back, which had my return address, and I never heard from the twins since that day. There was nothing until I sent the sheriff's department after I didn't hear from my second letter. I called the Pompano Beach Sheriff's Department or Police Department and asked them if they would make a well check that I was concerned about my twin daughters. And I gave them the names, and that's when they said Lauderdale Police Department needs to talk to you.
So you were sending this, just so the listeners know, you were sending them to the address that you had sent the letter to. You said that your daughters, okay, you sent them to the address that was on the letter that you sent. Okay. And what did Lauderdale have to tell you?
Well, that's when I talked to Sergeant Edward Madge, the detective there, and I was still in the north, but he said to me, we think that your girls may have been witnesses to a homicide. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what is going on? I mean, I am totally in the dark.
Yeah.
And that's when I took a plane and came to Florida. And that's when I got the whole story about this guy being shot, left in his car.
Well, let's talk about let's get into that right now. Who is this guy? Who is this guy? Who is Nelson Johnson?
Never seen him before in my life, never heard the name before until Sergeant Madge showed me the guy's picture and asked me if I knew him. I said, I've never seen that man. And the thing of it is, he did live in Live Oak when he was younger. That I found out. But he had not lived in Live Oak for some years because he was 25 years old, had 2 jobs, and lived in Fort Lauderdale.
Nowhere near Live Oak. So there's no way that your daughters could have known him before they went down there to the Pompano Beach area. Well, what did you find out in the course of what they told you about Nelson Johnson? How was he connected to your daughters, and what ended up happening to him?
Okay, what happened was Sergeant Madge said that he had talked to this Johnson guy's mother in Fort Lauderdale and the brother. And the brother had told him that Nelson said he was going to pick up the white girls. And that gave, when they were picking him up, and this was on a Friday night, which happened to be the 15th of September, I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm saying, well, why would he be going to pick up the girls? Because you have to remember now, the guy's just been killed, okay?
Yeah.
It's not like he's been dead for weeks or months.
Yeah.
He's just been killed. And then they bring out this name, Edwin Gross.
One of the guys that we mentioned just 10 minutes ago in this conversation, yes.
He said that they were friends from Live Oak. And I said, okay. They showed me a picture of him. I'd never seen that man before. And I told him, I said, I don't know this man. Now, the strange part is they never mentioned Marvin Warren, but Marvin Warren was one of the guys that was with Edward Gross that went south. Supposedly, they took my twins. That's what the father, I guess, had said they ran off with their boyfriends. But then the stepmother changed the story and said the first part of September they came to me and said they were going to go to a store, and they never returned. Well, I knew that was a lie because I had gotten a letter from them in August.
Right. Well, we're going to correct the record a little bit later in the program.
Okay.
We just want to stick to the circumstances of when you got down there. What you're saying is that your daughters were connected to the murder of Nelson Johnson through Ed Gross, who was a friend. I know this is very convoluted for the listeners, who was a friend of Marvin Warren, and Marvin Warren knew Patty and Peggy's sister. So that's how the connection was made.
Yes.
So when the mother of Nelson Johnson, who was murdered, said he was going to pick up the white girls, that's when the police figured out that the white girls probably meant your two daughters.
Absolutely. When they were talking to the brother of the deceased man, Nelson Johnson,
Mm-hmm.
he said they were going to a place called the Plank, which is like a disco there in Fort Lauderdale, okay? And he said they were sisters, or maybe he told them they were twins. I don't know, but he said that his brother said they were going to pick up the white girls, the two white girls. And they were going to go to the Plank. And they were going with another man, though. I mean, he didn't name the other man. They just said that him and another guy was going to pick them up and go to the Plank. But
it turns out that the address that your daughter sent that letter from to you in August just happened to be an apartment being rented out by Ed Gross, wasn't it? That's also how the connection was made. See.
Yes, Ed Gross had that apartment, and the twins were staying there, according to the police, with Ed Gross.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the newspapers had it all mixed up. They tried to say that Ed Gross lived in Fort Lauderdale. He didn't. He was staying right there in Pompano Beach.
And he had an apartment there, but just for a few months, not he wasn't planning to stay there.
Yeah, he was only there for a short time. He left that apartment in November of '79. I know that for a fact. I talked to one of the deputies by the name of Dix. D-I-X was his last name, in Live Oak, and he told me that him and Marvin Warren had come back to Live Oak in November, and the sheriff at the time in Live Oak had told Sergeant Madge, I can take care of these boys. You don't need to come up here, I forget what Sergeant Madge, how he worded it, but he wasn't needed to take care of his jurisdiction up there in Live Oak.
How did you find out that Nelson Johnson, he was supposed to meet Ed Gross the night that he ended up dead, wasn't he?
He never named Ed Gross as a person that he was going to take with the girls. But there's a funny thing about Nelson Johnson and Ed Gross. They knew each other in Live Oak when they were younger, when this kid was in school, when he was younger. And you got to remember, he's only 25 years old now when he got killed. And he was originally from Live Oak, Florida. But Ed Gross had stabbed Nelson Johnson with a knife when they were in Live Oak. And the sheriff's department told me that Ed Madge told me that they had a problem with that. So, yeah, they remained friends.
So what you're saying, Joyce, is at some point in the past, Nelson Johnson and Ed Gross had some sort of disagreement. This was years, though, before Nelson was murdered, right?
Yes, that's true.
Okay. How do we know for sure, or as much as we can be sure, that Nelson was going to meet Ed Gross that night that Nelson ended up being murdered and ending up in the trunk of his own car?
Ed, I'm not real sure about that because the trail led the detectives there in Lauderdale straight to Ed Gross.
Okay.
So they must have gotten that name and the connection from Nelson Johnson's family. Else, how would they have known to go to Pompano Beach and to Ed Gross? You know what I'm saying?
Yes. Yes. So somehow, what you're saying is somehow the police figured this out. Somehow.
Yes.
Somehow they made the connection.
Yes.
Now, you also have a very strange story about one of your daughters showing up at the police department looking for her sister. What can you tell the listeners about this? In the weeks before they disappeared, tell the listeners a little bit about that.
Okay. The newspapers had it wrong. It was Peggy that went to the to Pompano Beach Police Department to put in a missing person report on her sister Patty. And she had been gone 2 days. And then the next day, according to the Pompano Beach Sheriff's Police Department, Patty showed up with someone, and they said it was Johnson, but I don't believe it was Johnson. I think it was probably Ed Gross. The sheriff's department, the police department there in Pompano Beach never told me who she showed up with. They just said she showed up unharmed, and they dropped the missing persons case.
So it was Peggy that showed up at the police department.
Yes.
And she said,
for her sister.
Looking for Patty. And they obviously took a report? Did the police just
they did.
Your daughter go then? I mean, she's 17 years old. It would seem that the police would do more than just take the report and then say, okay, well, you're free to go now.
Well, of course. See, that's also got me stymied because the newspaper report that wrote on this said that she showed up, and I've got to tell you how the newspaper put it. The copy that I've got said that Patty, well, they had the names wrong. They had them backwards. But anyway, it was Peggy looking for Patty. Patty showed up supposedly with a guy named Johnson, and that she was okay. And then Ed Gross came in the picture somewhere because Johnson got into it with Ed Gross saying, "What are you thinking going off with a girl half your age?" And see that? Mm-hmm. That made me wonder too, because who is this Ed Gross that he's got the girls in Pompano Beach, yet this Nelson fella, Johnson, says, "What are you doing with the girl half your age, taking her away from her sister?" See, none of that made sense to me at all.
And how did you find that out again? Who told you that?
Beg pardon?
How did you find out about that? Who told you that story, that they had this discussion about Ed Gross being told? The newspaper said that.
The newspaper, yeah.
And do you have any idea where that conversation took place?
I have absolutely no idea if that ever took place.
That's interesting.
Because the sheriff's department, the police department didn't tell me that. That lady at that police department and just told me that Peggy had made a report to find her sister, and that she showed up the day after she had made that report, and they dropped the case. I mean,
How long was this before your daughters disappeared on September 15th? Was it a week before? Was it 2 weeks before?
yeah, it was like right before they disappeared.
Okay, so within a week. So Peggy goes into the police saying her sister disappeared. She can't find her. She's been gone for 2 days. And then
Yes,
somehow Patty does show up at the police department with either Nelson Johnson or Ed Gross, one of the two. And then they
one.
all leave. And then a few days later, Nelson Johnson's dead and your daughters are gone.
Yes, right.
Okay. All right. Now let's get to the other side of this. Being that we talked about their father a little bit at the beginning of this interview, what did he have all to say this? I know he didn't talk much to you. Do you have any idea where did he think his daughters were for this month? He had to have noticed that they were gone, right?
Well, he thought they had run away to be with these guys from Live Oak, which was Marvin Warren and Ed Gross.
Mm-hmm.
And he never talked to me. He talked to my daughter, okay, my oldest daughter. He wouldn't talk to me. He'd talk to her. And they'd be home. Not to worry about them. Tell your mother to quit looking for them because they'll show up. That was his words. And he got real angry at me, my daughter told me, for keeping it in the newspapers. He was tired of it being put on in the newspapers that they were missing. And that was it. That was the extent of, I've never heard anything else that he has ever said. He just wanted me to quit looking for them, that they would come home.
And so the way you found out about the disappearance of your daughters was not through your ex-husband, it was through the police.
No.
They were the ones that contacted you.
I heard it from the Pompano Beach police department that they to call Lauderdale. It was Lauderdale Police Department that told me we need to talk to you about your girls.
Right. Okay, how long after they disappeared did they contact you? Was it the next day?
Oh,
Was it a week? Was it the week later, or?
It was like it was less than a week from the time he got killed.
Okay.
Yeah, because I hadn't heard from the girls, so I wanted them to go and get a wellness check on them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I found out to call Lauderdale, and that's how I found out that they were looking for them.
When the police went to the address that you had sent that letter to, were Ed Gross and Marvin Warren there?
I don't know. They said that Ed Gross had rented that apartment.
Okay.
There was nothing. There was absolutely nothing, they said, that would make you think that the girls had ever been there.
Okay. While your daughters were down in the Pompano Beach area, say they went down there in mid-August, did they get jobs? Obviously they didn't go back to school, which is a whole other discussion. But
right.
did they have jobs? Were they working somewhere? Did they go down there and then what were they doing while they were down there?
Well, now this is what I think Ed Gross told Madge. He first told Madge that they had been working, that Peggy worked for a shoe store and Patty worked at a fast food joint, okay? And now, I went down there and tried to find out from the shoe store if Peggy had ever worked there. She did get a job there, but it didn't last long. She hadn't been there but a couple of weeks. I mean, and Patty, I don't think Patty kept her job. Those girls had never worked. They had never been out in the public much. they just were not capable of going out in the world, holding down a job, and taking care of themselves. That I can tell you. And I think it was a Butler shoe store, and the man told me that they did have Peggy McDaniel that worked there, but she had only worked there a very short time. I think he said a couple of weeks or a week, and she never came back. No, because she disappeared that Friday night.
So her job had no idea what happened to her. She just didn't show up one day, and they were like, "Oh, I guess this teenage girl just didn't show up for work."
Yeah, and I wanted the Social Security number. They wouldn't even give me her Social Security number. That's another thing. I wanted her Social Security number, and they said, we can't give that to you. Now, the place Patty supposedly worked, I don't know. We never found that place. You know, it's not like there wasn't any place to eat down there. There's a million places.
Yeah.
And Ed Gross, when he was being questioned by the Lauderdale Police Department, he said the girls had left with a white man in a Vega. And listen to this. They had left now. On the Friday night, they were supposed to go to the plank.
The same night that
never mentioned that.
And the same night that Nelson Johnson was murdered.
Yes, but Gross never mentioned that. He said they had left like a week before, and we know that was a lie because Peggy had been looking for her sister, so they couldn't have left with this guy in a white Vega.
Right. So, yeah, Ed Gross says that like a week before that, that's when the girls had disappeared, but that's not.
Yeah, they
that's
just
not the
took
case.
off with this guy in a white Vega, right?
But there is proof because your one daughter ended up going to the police.
Knew he was lying.
Yeah, of course they did. So that's what Ed. And what about Marvin? Was he asked about? He was down there too. Was he ever asked about any of this?
They never talked to Marvin that I know of.
Oh,
okay. This is another mystery. Marvin Warren's name was never mentioned by the police department to me. I know they questioned other people, but his name never came up.
And eventually, of course, this case is still unsolved, and we should know Nelson Johnson's murder has never been solved, has it?
No.
They still have not ever taken anybody into custody for the murder of Nelson Johnson.
No.
Okay, so now there are a couple other interesting things about this. Once the police started looking into this, where did they find your daughter's bikes?
At Marvin Warren's house in Live Oak, Florida.
Okay. So the thinking is that the daughters knew Ed Gross, Marvin Warren, rode their bikes over there, and they all jumped in a car or something and just headed right down the highway for several hours, I might say, the whole way down to the Pompano Beach area. Now, they stopped. You found out that they stopped at a truck stop. Tell the listeners about that.
All right. The detective, Madge, told me that he had tracked the girls to a truck stop on the Florida Turnpike. And he didn't tell me how he did it. He just told me he did it. And he said, I talked to the woman there that was in charge. And she said that Patty and Peggy were by themselves. That they showed up by themselves, and she let them stay there. And Detective Madge never said how many days that I can remember. If he told me, I don't remember it. But Peggy had went in to the restaurant part of the truck stop and told the lady, there's a black man that is stalking us. A big black man is stalking us. And she, kept her eye open, whatever, to see if anything was going on. And she said, then the girls were gone. They just were gone. They never said goodbye. They didn't say where they were going. Nothing. They just took their stuff and left.
And this is believed to have been the time when they left Live Oak and were headed to Pompano Beach, that area, that they stopped there and it could be read into that maybe even at that point maybe your daughters were trying to get away. Maybe they knew that's
so.
Okay.
That's exactly what I believe. I believe that they were on their own at that time, just like the lady said, and I think Ed Gross got up with them and forced them to go with him.
Mm-hmm.
That's how they ended up in Pompano Beach.
Now, what
why?
Well, now what did your daughters? There was a story also that you told me about them having an uncle in Vero Beach. What can you tell the listeners about that?
That's what they told this lady at the truck stop. I'd forgotten about that. I have a brother that lives in Vero Beach. He's been there for many moons. And they had told this lady that they were going to their uncle's house in Vero Beach. Now, they never showed up at my brother's house.
And he didn't know they were coming.
He didn't even have him or his wife never even had an inkling that those twins were trying to get to them. That's how I know that Patty and Peggy was there, because nobody knew I had a brother in Vero Beach.
Right, that's like a verification that they gave that piece of information to this woman.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
That's a good point.
I think they were trying to run away, and they got to that truck stop and stayed there, told that lady that somebody was stalking them, and they told her they were trying to get to their uncle's house. And that, I couldn't have made that up. I could not have even dreamed they would be going to my brother's house, because they had not seen my brother since they were little children, very, very small. Mm-hmm. I mean, they'd heard me talk about him, but they had not seen him. So that's how I
know. So the police asked Ed Gross, and not to our knowledge Marvin Warren, but Ed Gross, because we have all the proof in the world that he was down there, had rented out this apartment. He never, he was asked about it, but that's been it in all these years. That's been the extent of the investigation into your daughter's disappearance.
He was the main suspect in the Johnson killing. Yes.
Okay. Now we need to talk about something else, and this is where, if the listeners are paying attention, it's a very convoluted story, a lot of players in it, different locations, but there's been a lot of misinformation out there regarding this. And I want to correct the record on something right now. Regarding what happened afterwards, this rumor, or whatever you want to call it, of a few months later, of somebody breaking into your ex-husband's house. What can you tell us about that?
Yes. 2 months after they were looking for Patty and Peggy in September. In November, Ed Gross and Marvin Warren ended up back in Suwannee County, which is Live Oak. And the story was put out to the police. Maybe imagine them were in Live Oak looking for Gross, okay? They must have talked to my ex-husband, because he told them that somebody, he didn't say Patty and Peggy, he said someone broke into our house, and the only thing was missing was winter clothes. And the part they told Madge was that there was a jar that had a bunch of pennies and things in it that had been spilled on the floor. Okay. Now, Patty and Peggy had keys to go to that house. They didn't have to break in, number one. Number two, I don't believe it was Patty and Peggy. I think it was Ed Gross or Marvin Warren, maybe the two of them, broke into his house, took some clothing to make people think they were coming back to New Jersey, that they had left.
Your daughters were going back to New Jersey.
Yes, I think that was a ruse. If someone did break in there, it would have had to have been Ed Gross. And the only thing he would have taken, now, Bob said they took the winter clothes. I had winter clothes for them. See, that's another thing. Why would they break in to take winter clothes when their clothes were in New Jersey? I had their clothes, their boots, everything they would need for the winter.
How much do you think that circumstance, that incident, that burglary that happened a couple months afterwards, how much do you think it affected the police investigation into your daughter's disappearance? My perception all these years later is it would hurt it, because then the police would think, oh, these are a couple girls that just ran away.
I do, because I think it gave Ed Madge and them the idea that maybe they were still alive. And I will tell you that they did investigate around Live Oak, Florida, because they had a couple of the deputies from the Live Oak Sheriff's Department there tell the investigators that there was a rumor in town that there was some white girls running with some black man, okay? Which they never proved that. They never found any evidence of that. I think that was the rumor, okay? It was a rumor. Even the sheriff's deputy said that went nowhere. They could find nothing.
Much earlier in this conversation, you had talked about the phone call, this phone bill that your two daughters ran up. That ended up being like $300. Somehow
Yes.
that has gotten construed to be those phone calls happened after they disappeared.
Yes, and
could
that's
you please
a lie.
that's a lie. Do you have any idea where that information even came from?
No, I have no idea how that story got out.
No.
That made absolutely no sense.
So for the record, after September 15th, 1979, you've never received one phone call from anybody that you ever thought was one of your daughters, ever?
No, nothing.
Okay, very good.
Absolutely nothing. It was as though they just disappeared off the face of the earth.
Were you satisfied at the time of what the police tried to do to find your daughters, even though there was some of these things that were kind of like misinformation and everything? Do you think that they did all they could in this circumstance?
No, I don't. Do you want me to tell you what I really believe?
Please, the listeners always want to hear what my guests really believe. Always.
I really believe in 1979, they had these two girls that they knew nothing about. They didn't know they were young, inexperienced. They just saw two white girls with the black men. And they just turned it off as they were prostitutes, and Ed Gross was their pimp, okay? They made it sound like they had been in cahoots for months and months and months.
They when you say they, you mean the girls and Ed Gross?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's not true, because I know for a fact that they never even went down to South Florida until August, near the after the middle of August. I know it was after the middle of August. And I understand that people do put girls into situations, but they should have never taken it with the attitude that I believe that the sheriff's department had. I just feel that they didn't do all they could do.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't interested in my girls. They wanted to solve a murder case.
Right. Something in a murder case they still haven't solved 38 years later.
Absolutely. It's still unsolved. Unless they get something, they will not open it up unless they get some new information. And it's the same way with my girls. Unless they get some new information, they're not going to reopen their case. And I don't think it was actually investigated thoroughly.
What kind of lives did Ed Gross and Marvin Warren live after they went back to Live Oak?
They went to prison. They weren't up there very long, and the two of them, when I checked back in, because I made a lot of trips to Florida looking for my children, and I went back to the sheriff's department, and they told me that both of those guys were in Lake Butler awaiting being sent out to general population in the penal system in Florida. That's what I heard.
And they were in and out of jail for a long time. And in fact, we don't believe Ed Gross is still alive, do we?
No, we don't.
Okay, but Marvin Warren is.
Yes, he is. I saw him on Facebook, but I can't say anything other than that.
Okay.
I don't know the man. I'd never seen him.
Right. So Ed Gross, one of the main suspects, and maybe a co-conspirator of some type, Marvin Warren. Ed Gross is dead. Marvin Warren, though, is still alive.
Yes.
What do you think happened to your daughters?
I think that they were murdered the same night that early Friday night or early Saturday morning, the 15th of September, 1979. I truly believe that Ed Gross and Marvin Warren, or Ed Gross and somebody else, killed them because they were witnesses to that murder.
To the murder of Nelson Johnson.
Yes, I truly believe, because those girls, look, let me tell you, they didn't have to go after some guy's $1,100, okay?
Well, hold on. If the listeners don't know what we're talking about, Nelson Johnson, we didn't mention this during that part of it. Nelson Johnson had, by all accounts, had a lot of money. Had a lot of money on him at the time that he was murdered, and the money disappeared.
Yes, it was in a briefcase. He had a briefcase. He had $1,100 in it, and now his mother said it should have been in the trunk of his car. Now, whether he took it out before he went to the plank to pick up the girls, to take them out, I don't know. But Ed Gross, Sergeant Madge said that there was no briefcase and no money in the trunk of that car, and it had been wiped clean.
Okay.
Now, there had to be another person involved for the simple reason, who drove them away from that Firestone store in Lauderdale after the murder. Somebody had to drive Patty and Peggy away from that car if they were even in it, okay? They had to have driven them. The murderer had to have been driven from that site in an automobile. And I believe with all my heart they couldn't. They must have, and here's another theory that I'm thinking. I think they did go to the plank. And I think that they murdered Johnson, for what reason I don't know, but put him in his car, then they drove the car into Lauderhill to leave it. And they would have killed the girls and they had to dispose of them, but they didn't have a vehicle, so they just threw them out somewhere. And maybe they buried them somewhere. I don't know. All I know is they didn't show up in Live Oak with them guys, and they've never been heard from since the night they went to the plane on the 15th day of September 1979.
Mm-hmm. What did this do to you and your family, Joyce? When
What
this,
did this do to us?
yeah, how was your family affected by this?
Oh my God. I thought my life had ended. The only thing that kept me going was the fact that I had a little baby in the household. I got married in 1980 to the man that I'm living with today. We're still married. He helped me so much. If it had not been for him and his money and my money and the many trips we made to Florida looking for these girls and the people at my workplace, I work for a big hospital up in Jersey, I would have lost my mind. I'm going to tell you. I used to go and look for them. I even went to Disney World over in Orlando. And I'm looking. I'm saying, well, they were born in Orlando. All my children were born in Orlando. Maybe they went to Orlando. And I'm at Disney World, and I'm watching the parade, and I could see my girls' faces in these people. And I know it sounds crazy, but I'm running after these people, calling my girls' names because I'm thinking, oh, my God, that looks just like Patty and Peggy. And it was no good. I could see their face and people, and I would just run up to people, and it wouldn't be them. That's how crazy I was at the time. It destroyed my son. My son was only like 8 years old when his sisters disappeared. And that boy went into a shell, and you couldn't speak their name around him. He would just clam up and it affected him for years. We could not talk about Patty and Peggy around him because those kids just carried him around and doted on him. And my other younger daughter, she was young at the time. She was like 12 years old, and they suffered. When they heard me crying and carrying on, they had to cry, and because they were suffering with me. I thought I was going to lose my mind.
But you didn't. And here you are, 38. Here you are, 38 years later, still looking for answers.
Still looking.
Where have you found their strength, Joyce?
Through God. I just kept praying. 5 years I prayed so earnestly and begged God to let me know where my girls were. And Ed, I don't know if you want to hear this story, but I had a dream about them.
Please share it with the listeners. Please do.
I had a dream, and there's the girls at 17 years old, and I walked into this room, and they had cut their hair in my dream. And I said, hey, you girls have cut your hair. And they looked at me and they said, yes, Mama. And I was talking to them, and after I was talking to them, I said, you girls coming home with Mama? And they said, we can't. We're under the palmettos asleep. I wrote that down. I wrote that dream down, and I still have it to this day. And I haven't read it for a long time, but I used to read it quite often. And it told me those girls were under the palmettos asleep. Now, that told me they were dead.
Yeah.
Because I don't know if they were just thrown out up under the palmettos or whether they are actually buried in a grave somewhere under them, but it would have had to have been, they would have had to have been disposed of somewhere in South Florida or on the road back to Live Oak. I mean, since the guys didn't come back until November, I believe they were killed and disposed of right down there near Fort Lauderdale.
Okay, Joyce. Joyce, you're on Facebook, aren't you? I want the listeners to be able to find you, to friend you on Facebook. You know, my listeners are very active in communicating with guests that I've had on Unfound, and I'd like to do that with you. You're on Facebook, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
Okay. You know, I live here in Florida. I'd never even heard of the disappearance, and I'm very versed in disappearance cases. I'd never even heard of the disappearance of your daughters until Mary Lyle called me, our mutual friend. Of course, she appeared on an earlier episode of Unfound to talk about the disappearance of her daughter. So I want to work with you, you know, to get the word out there, and maybe we can dig some things up after all these years.
Okay. Oh, I would like that. Yes.
You know, and we had talked about the misinformation that is out there
yes.
on Reddit and some other places, some stories about what happened that absolutely are not true.
Right.
So we're going to try to correct that. We're going to try to do that.
Thank God.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to tell the listeners before we conclude this interview?
Well, I noticed. I know that a lot of the people that has read the different accounts in the papers or whatever, they think that I didn't care about those daughters. Oh my God, they could never even imagine the trips, flying and driving and looking over the years, and I've never give up. I've always called or went someplace to try and find new evidence. And I'm getting nowhere with the Broward County Sheriff's Department for the simple reason there's no new info to make them open the case. So this whole case got misconstrued from the beginning. It was never handled right. Like I said, they were looking to solve a homicide. I was looking for two angels, and they just made it. It was bad. It just never was the right way. It was not handled right.
Well, Joyce, we're going to try to correct that now all these years later in 2017. I'm going to do all I can for you. My listeners, I know, are going to feel for you. Hopefully they can help you as well.
Oh, I pray that somebody will hear and talk about it.
Joyce, I deeply appreciate you joining me and the listeners on this episode of Unfound.
Thank you, Ed. I appreciate your time and your devotion.
You're welcome, Joyce.
And that was my conversation with Joyce Rivituzo. I have to admit, from the first moment I talked to her, I liked her. I will admit, in some of the other cases with people who I've interviewed, I think it took a little time before that person and myself kind of warmed up to each other. They didn't know me. I don't know them. And eventually, of course, in the end, I think that I grow to be very close with all of my guests on the show, and I talk to many of them quite often. But in Joyce's case, there was just something about it within the first 30 seconds. We just kind of clicked, and I think that was reflective in the interview. At least I hope it was. I think it was. I hope you felt the same way. I'm going to continue to work with her. Actually, off air, She and I brainstormed some things that she could be doing even all these years later, but we kept them out of the interview for privacy reasons. And I need to thank Mary Lyle, who was the one that made that interview happen. Mary Lyle, just out of the blue one day, called me, and I actually had to call her back. She told me about Joyce Rivituzo in this case, and she thought that I might be able to help Joyce out. And I was more than happy to do so. Also, we've covered so many disappearances on Unfound, and they're all horrible, tragic, and sad. And I wish none of them would have happened. And I hope they all get solved before the guests that I've had on this show leave this earth. But I don't think I truly contemplated the loss of 2 children to parents, a mother, a father, until this case. I guess maybe I was a little too short-sighted. I'm not sure. Maybe it's because you think, well, one child being lost is horrible. It can't get any worse than that. And then you run into a case like this. I don't know how you quantify what Joyce has been through. Emotionally, I don't know how you do that. One thing we didn't mention in the interview that maybe some of you were wondering about was what happened to the letter that Peggy and Patty sent. It would be interesting to see that letter. Unfortunately, I had learned from Joyce that somewhere between 1979 and now, it was lost. And I think what happened was that Joyce, of course, understanding what was in the letter and how Peggy and Patty were sounding, she took the letter very seriously. But, of course, in her thinking, well, I'll send them a letter. They'll get it. They'll go to the airport. I'll send them money. They'll fly back to New Jersey. And in a couple weeks, this will all be forgotten. And this letter won't mean that much. I think that's what happened. I think that they didn't know. She didn't know. Maybe the rest of Joyce's family didn't, who were living with her in New Jersey, fully didn't understand how much of an impact that letter would have somewhere down the road. In fact, you could almost call it a piece of evidence in a way. And it would certainly be interesting to read that letter all these years later. I think just at the time, didn't fully appreciate where all of this was going to go. Why? Well, I don't think any mother can imagine losing a daughter or 2 daughters or a son, 2 sons, in the way that this happened. Nobody really thinks about that. But it would be interesting to see that letter all these years later. Being that the theme for this episode is connecting the dots, I'm going to do a little bit of that right now. The main question is this, and this is something that I continued to think about while I was doing the interview. Why is this case somewhat unknown and unsolved? It's the disappearances of 2 sisters and a murder connected to it. And this is a case that at the time this episode came out, it wasn't on major missing person sites out there. How is that possible? How do we connect the dots to try to figure out why that is the case? I think the main factor was the break-in months later. I think it totally set the police off in the wrong direction. And in fact, I even found an article that says so. And in fact, I posted it to the Unfound podcast discussion group a couple days ago. This caused the police to think that the girls were still alive and somehow they had made their way from Pompano Beach back up to Live Oak, broke into that house, and stole some winter clothing so they could run off to wherever, maybe even going the whole way back to New Jersey. The problem is just that little piece of information, however that break-in happened, whether it was Ed Gross and Marvin Warren once they got back there who did that, or I'm even open to the idea that maybe the father of Peggy and Patty might have done that himself, maybe feeling a little guilty or something like that. I have no idea. The guy sounds like a weird guy to me. I don't know. But just something simple as that, a break-in at the father's house a couple months later was enough to set the police off in a totally different direction. They had connected the dots so well down in Pompano Beach, finding a relationship between this murder of Nelson Johnson and the disappearances of Peggy and Patty. Such a great job on their part. Really good job. But I think that they connected too many dots, thus distorting the picture of what happened. And those extra dots being that break-in in Live Oak that they automatically thought was done by Peggy and Patty. I think it's pretty obvious 38 years later that that was not the case, that that was done by somebody else. But at the time, and the police eventually should have figured that out, but just a little piece like that, the police getting off the track, getting into the news, has caused, I think, people to continue to think that Peggy and Patty McDaniel are still alive out there, and that's the reason that this case isn't better known. Just something as simple as that. We're always searching for those reasons. Why is this case well known? This one isn't. And I think that we can put the blame for the reason this case is unknown and still unsolved to the police getting off the track when they accepted that that break-in was done by Peggy and Patty. My opinion, looking at it all these years later. They took the break-in too seriously, and you get a feeling it seems they wanted a reason to stop looking, and the break-in gave them a reason. And really, that break-in only served to bolster Ed Gross's claim that the girls ran off with a white guy in a white car. And the claim that Ed and Marvin were the girls' boyfriends, which isn't supported by the evidence at all, is then thought to be true because of this break-in. And that's something that continues to be seen on Reddit. In a way, there were like too many dots. The police didn't know when to stop and say, hey, we already have a clear picture. And even after Ed and Marvin went to jail, it doesn't seem the police ever changed their minds. So what did happen? I really believe that these girls were sex trafficked. I think that this plays out like a 1979 version of what happened to Jessie Foster, a case that we covered on Unfound. Where in Jessie Foster's case, an older man took her to Las Vegas under one pretense, and then before long, she was a prostitute on the streets of Las Vegas, then it ended up disappearing. How is that any different than what happened to Peggy and Patty McDaniel? It's the same. Two young women with an older man taken to a new city where they're not familiar with anything. And I think that's what was going on there in August of 1979. I think that's the reason the girls sent the letter to their mother, but being 17-year-old girls, they didn't want to tell their mother everything. They figured, well, once we get back to New Jersey, we'll sit her down and we'll tell her what we got mixed up in, and then she'll understand, because if she reads it in a letter, who knows what can happen. I think that they got those jobs because Ed Gross told them to. They were like covers to keep up appearances. But really, Ed Gross was trying to make, I think, Peggy and Patty part of his harem down in the Pompano Beach area. That's the exact reason that he got that apartment, even though he was living up in Live Oak. I think they sent that letter because the girls knew they were in over their heads. And it's probably a perfect example that had this been 2017, of course, these girls would have cell phones that have Facebook pages and everything else. And probably if this happens in 2017, frankly, probably Peggy and Patty McDaniel are still alive. But the limitations of communication back then probably was one of the contributing factors in their disappearance. I believe that Ed Gross got the letters that Joyce sent. I don't think Peggy or Patty ever saw either of those letters that their mother sent. He got them, and that's probably when he figured out, I need to make these two girls go away. They're going to be too much trouble for me. And on top of that, he probably had Nelson Johnson's murder planned days, if not weeks in advance. And he probably figured out, I think I'll just take care of this all in one night. I'll convince Nelson that he can go out with these girls, being that, they work for me and they're my prostitutes and they're turning tricks for me now down in Pompano Beach. I'll set him up with them. And once he shows up, I'll kill him, take the money that's on him, and then I can get rid of Peggy and Patty at the same time. I think that makes a lot of sense. The good news for Joyce Rivituzo and her family is that Marvin Warren is still alive. He's in his 50s. He was only 19 when this all happened. So there's still a chance to solve this. We have a major person in this disappearance and in the murder, at least that's the way I think, who is still alive, who can still answer questions. And I'm hoping that the police will track him down and see if he wants to talk about what happened on September 15th, 1979. And if that happens, I'll, of course, let all of you know. And that's the program for today. I'll leave the rest of the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to the app that you use to listen to Unfound and give this podcast a nice review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.